We're getting back. Oh, with numbers rising again. Hopefully we're all safe and doing what we can. But this is the session. We've covered some interesting ground. We talked about Pharisees and Sadducees. We've talked about Maimonides. We've talked about Zionism for a couple sessions. Now I want to kind of bring us to where we are now, and what are some of the real challenges facing Judaism and Jewish life. I'd say we should probably specify, I'm talking from a non-Orthodox, a liberal Jewish perspective. Because the challenges are different. I mean, there's some shared challenges, obviously anti-Semitism, which we've covered. I did a whole class on that, wrote a whole book on that. But the challenges, I think, for non-Orthodox Judaism are a little bit different today than say Orthodoxy, and there's so many of them. I mean, it's kind of hard to really assess all of that. In fact, just one of them, as I was preparing for our class, I got an email, and this is a whole nother set of challenges. I don't know if anyone's aware. I am sure a few of you are, if you sort of follow Reform Judaism insider baseball to kind of know what's going on within the movement. But about a year ago, somebody wrote in on Facebook. There was a professor named Michael Cook. I had him as a professor, and I didn't really like him very much, to be honest with you. He wasn't one of my favorite professors, but I had him. I took his class, and anyway, somebody wrote in after he died. People were talking about what a great person he was, and somebody wrote in, well, actually, the story is much more complex than that. Professor Cook harassed me when I was a student. This is what someone wrote in on Facebook. And I remember seeing it and I thought, wow, this person has guts. I mean, to say that in a public forum. And then other people started saying it as well. And it snowballed. I mean, it was really, just talk about grassroots change. It's really tremendous. And then ultimately it led to a investigation where Hebrew Union College did an assessment of its sexual harassment over the last 40 years and found many, I think 7 professors, including 2 presidents of the school. And then that also led to the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, doing an assessment, and then the URJ doing an assessment and uncovering all this stuff that had been buried under the carpet. Some people knew about, some didn't. But anyways, that all is quite interesting. But now I just got another email of people who are former employees or current employees of the Union for Reform Judaism saying that they are not doing enough to respond to the ethics accountability report, which just was issued a month ago, to give them the benefit of the doubt. But the point is that it is just this incredible source of tension that there is such a greater sense of awareness of things that had once been pushed under the rug, and now institutions have to address it. But how do you address it effectively? I mean, so this is a major source of controversy in some ways, because there is a sense that the credibility of institutions that were gatekeepers, that exerted influence and had power, that these institutions were essentially corrupt and didn't do their job properly. And now they're being pushed to change, and they're maybe resistant to change. So, and Reform Judaism has always been really kind of centralized around, I mean, it's really based in congregations, but on a movement level, there are these institutions, the 3 primary ones. They were all founded by Isaac Mayer Wise. The Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which is now the URJ, which sort of represents the congregations, the CCAR, Central Conference of American Rabbis, that represents the rabbis, and the Hebrew Union College, which is the seminary. Now, of course, they've all there are lots of other organizations too, Women of Reform Judaism, the educators. I mean, there's a lot of them now, but those are sort of the three main ones, if you want to think of a triangle. And they're all now beset by institutional difficulties. So how does a movement kind of sustain itself? I mean, this not unlike the Catholic Church in some ways. If you think about it, the Catholic Church is even more centralized than Reform Judaism, but the Catholic Church kind of had the same issues where you had higher level institutional corruption that then that undermines the sort of cohesiveness and the vitality of the larger community. And all of this then, besides the controversy itself, there are second order effects of this controversy. The second order effects are that many people are alienated from organized religion. And that's a 100% true. There's really, I was conducting a funeral a couple of days ago, and I ran into an old friend of mine that we went to summer camp together. And he grew up in Deerfield, went to a conservative synagogue. And, he's got kids a little younger than mine, I think 11 and 8. And I said, oh, you guys join a synagogue yet? He's like, no, I was trying to get him to join. And basically he said, we're just not at all interested in religious life. Not that he had a bad experience growing up Jewish or anything like that, but they're just totally uninterested. And so some of that is just, the world is more secular, but some of that, especially for I think this is probably more true in the Catholic community than the Jewish community, but it's still true in the Jewish community, just kind of alienated from organized religious life. And that is a tremendous source of anxiety, I think, for Jewish leaders and for really anyone who cares about Judaism. How do you deal with kind of this sense of alienation? And so some of that may be a response to the corruption, certainly in the Catholic Church, that's very prominent. People who said, I can't be part of an institution that covers up, rape and sexual violence and, just, awful stuff. And some of it within the Reform movement or non-Orthodox Jewry is kind of, I just don't feel connected to what the movement stands for, what it has, achieved. Some of that revolves around Israel, kind of what we talked about last week with people feeling alienated from modern day Israel, but some of it's just general a lack of connection, a lack of feeling of commitment. So I think that's a tremendous challenge. Now, some of the more conservative critics or observers of this would say, well, that's primarily a result of intermarriage and assimilation. That's what people would say. In fact, there's a whole article, I found it while I was preparing today, that kind of makes this argument that says, well, one of the reasons people feel alienated from religion and alienated from Israel is that they don't have the history because they converted to Judaism or they grew up pretty assimilated. This is a very interesting article that makes this point. So that essentially, people who don't have a shared ethnic memory, that if there's no feeling, how sometimes our attachments, our loves are not always rational. They come from childhood experiences, they come from the stories we hear. And if we grew up without hearing stories of our immigrant ancestors or, grandma's chicken soup, that kind of, those kind of endearing stories, that we don't have that emotional connection to Judaism. And that many people who are part of the Jewish community today don't have that emotional connection. That's according to this logic. So when something bad happens, they immediately say, I'm out of here. I don't feel, so you know how when you're with family, if, when something bad happens in a family, people rally to support. If something bad happens to something you have a sort of, a tangential connection to, you may not. So essentially this author, Jack Wertheimer, is saying that many Jews today, especially those who didn't grow up Jewish, just have a tangential connection to Judaism. And that's a problem. So he says we should be leaner and meaner. We should be, more focused on the core devotees and kind of the people who really care. That should be our focus. Okay. Yeah, here he said, this is very interesting. Giving to Jewish causes is now the province of a minority of Jews, having slid from 56% in 2013 to 48% in 2020. By the way, that's definitely true. The Chicago Jewish Federation, the Chicago Jewish Federation is a very strong federation, but the percentage of Jews in Chicago who give has gone down significantly over the last 10 years. There are still a lot of big givers, but the percentage of Chicago Jews who give has gone down. And I'm sure that's true in everywhere. He just said it. Only 42% of Jewish adults consider their Jewishness, no matter how they define it, to be a very important part of their lives, down from 46%. 30% of American Jewish adults claim to feel very attracted to Israel in 2013. 7 years later, that figure dropped by 5%. Close friendship with other Jews is no longer as common. 1/4 of Jewish adults claim they have hardly any or no close Jewish friends, an increase of 4%. Even if we remove religious participation from the discussion, Jewish secular culture, or what used to be called peoplehood engagement, is also weaker. Taken together, these figures suggest declining commitment to specifically Jewish causes, distancing from the Jewish state and its people, and the fraying of Jewish social networks so necessary for anchoring Jews to their people. That's really interesting. Really interesting. Take for example, this is somewhat of a uniquely North Shore example, and maybe perhaps it's not all that important, but we did have a Jewish country club that closed. What was it, Green Acres? I had dinner there a couple times. That was a nice club. Closed. We still have others, but those kinds of in Milwaukee, where my parents live, and where the country club where I had my bar mitzvah, beautiful Jewish country club, closed. So obviously, country clubs only appeal to a certain percentage of the population and reflect a certain demographic. But the fact that they were Jewish organizations that brought Jews together socially, those have declined all over the place, and that reflects a certain change. Now, maybe one could argue that maybe those changes are good. Maybe Jews are less insular, and that Jews are more outward and exposed to the larger world, and that's true. However, it's kind of like that quote from Hillel: "If I am not for myself, who will be for me?" Right? You do have to have a basis, So, for example, it's great if Jews contribute to important organizations like Ravinia or the Botanic Garden. Okay, I love those organizations. Neither of them need any money. They both have too much money they don't know what to do with, but it's wonderful people contribute to those organizations. However, who's going to contribute to synagogues and to Jewish causes? Right? In some ways, it's not right for anyone to tell someone else what to do with their money, but you do need to support the causes that only you can support. So that's a real danger, and when you don't have that sense of commitment, I think you start to lose the core. And when you lose the core, you lose everything else. Okay, I've done a little talking. There's much more to say, but let's take some questions and discussions. Alice?
Yeah, boy, everything you said really hits home. I'm just going to comment on one thing. When I moved to Highland Park, which was in 1980, 81, so I I had all these friends from, the past who lived there already. Long story short, one of the first things that one of my friends said to me was, you have to join, it was back then, it was Women's American Ort. Now I know that's what I joined because that's where my friends were. But I know women were either asked to join the National Council of Jewish Women, Hadassah, or Ort. I think those were three of the big ones. And it was, for me, then we also joined a synagogue, but for me, that was like a real Jewish connection. It was with other Jewish women and men also, and we were raising money for Jewish causes. And I do actually, one of my really good friends, she was the president of the region at one point, and that's her argument, Rabbi, was just what you were saying. She would say, all these other organizations have lots of people that can give to them. There are not that many Jews. You have to support Jewish organizations.
True.
But the point I'm going to make is that was back, in the 80s and 90s. Ever since the 80s, it's gone down and down and down and down, the number of people. We stood on our heads to try to get young women. When I then was in my 50s, we were trying to get these women in their 30s. We could not get people to join.
Yeah.
And so, it's just an example of one thing, but to me, it's very sad because that was, and it continues to be such a big identification for me and keeping me informed of what was happening in the Jewish community all over the world. And a lot of the young Jewish people don't have that. Whatever organization, I'm just using mine as an example, whatever organization you're talking about.
It's a great point. And I think you're so right. And there are a few reasons for it. So one is just the general cultural demographic. There was a famous book written in 1990 called Bowling Alone, which the whole premise of the book was that more people are going bowling, but fewer people are part of bowling leagues, and that people are just not as connected to groups. So that's one thing. But even more specifically, Jewish organizations. Now, people used to blame this on women working, but that doesn't really correlate because other groups are doing fine. I think it's much more, and sure, some of it is people don't have as much free time. Okay. But I think even larger is the lack of a feeling of group commitment, that people just don't see the value in it. And in some ways here, the interesting thing is, in some ways you have to join it in order to see the value. Like you can't objectively say you are going to feel happier in your life if you join this organization, because there's no proof. You have to jump in before you can really experience it. And in some ways you had positive peer pressure. You moved here and people said, you need to join here. You said, okay, that's part of it. And it worked. And now people just don't, it's not as exerted as much anymore. And people do other things with their free time in some ways. And what people do with their free time generally is more individual oriented. It's more, or maybe in like small groups of 2 or 3, but not larger groups like that really connect you to Ort organizations across the country. And I remember the Ort thrift shop in Highland Park. That was a great thrift shop. Think of all the good that did for people. It really helped people. So, that I think that is a tremendous loss. And I think there are a lot of reasons. I wish I knew more about what it was, but I think it's a larger cultural phenomenon. Yeah. Sue?
I think people are getting away from religious-based organizations, and they're joining more uniform, more American type of organizations. They've assimilated. And when you talk about a Jewish country club, people are saying, hey, I could join another country club. It doesn't have to be 100% Jewish, and I can play my golf and I can do this and that. I think a lot of people are getting away from religious-based type of organizations.
Somewhat, I think, but I am sure that secular country clubs are having the same issues. I think it's more about the organizations than specifically Jewish ones. I mean, I forgot another great example, the Standard Club. I mean, there you go. There was an organization that was in existence since 1861. I mean, that takes a lot to close an organ. Some of that's just financial, and I'm sure there were other issues, but, and the pandemic didn't help either. No, it's a good point. Sometimes it's just moving away from Jewish organizations. Sue Wellick.
Okay, so I mean, I certainly have seen this trend happening over the years. And what's interesting when you talk about having this inner feeling that people are losing. And I remember raising my children in Aurora, Illinois, where there was one Jewish congregation, and we were a very small minority. And I had a lot of Gentile friends, and we mixed with all people. But I will tell you that I always felt that within my congregation, and I was active in the National Council of Jewish Women and Hadassah and my Temple Sisterhood, and my kids went to Sunday school and Hebrew school, but I always felt more comfortable among my Jewish friends. And I don't think that's the case with so many people today. I found even something as simple as when my son was, looking for colleges when he was in high school. And one of my good Christian friends couldn't understand why I was encouraging him to go to large university. And he was applying to Illinois and to UCLA and to Michigan and what have you. And her son she only wanted small schools for him. And that's where she couldn't understand that I said, my son needs to go where there's a Hillel and where there's a Jewish community. And a little school isn't going to do that for him. That was totally out of her frame of reference.
It's very
She
interesting.
didn't get where I was coming from.
And why do you think?
And I think so many parents today aren't thinking about those things. They're not, I have to say, I talk to my children about marriage and how important it was for them to marry within our faith. I said, how are you going to feel when you have to celebrate Easter and you have to celebrate Christmas? How's that going to make you feel? And I don't think parents today do that.
No. Why do you think that?
People will think, maybe they think I was wrong or I was, prejudiced. And that wasn't it. It wasn't prejudice. It was trying to keep our culture alive within my family.
Right. That's a great
But I don't
point.
think that happens today anymore.
No. I don't think so either. And I think, one could say that part of it is a reduction of anti-Semitism. I mean, obviously we're seeing a resurgence now, but the resurgence now it's different. It's not as sort of mainstream. You're seeing it on the edges of society, whereas earlier anti-Semitism was more establishment, whereas now it's sort of more edgier, and I think your point is, I think there may be just some shifting cultural. Jews are very much accepted in America. So in some ways, Jews, when you were growing up, were kind of outsiders. Even if you had wonderful Gentile friends, as you said, you're just a little more comfortable. You can have different conversations. Today, that's not as true. And so that affects the values people have and what they want to pass on. Whereas today there's just a general cultural acceptance. Some of that might have to do with the fact that we're a more multicultural society. Some of it might just have to do with Jews have sort of made it, if you want to think of it that way. Although there are probably still some remnants of it, there's still some remnants of, I'm sure that there are some buildings in New York where they don't really have any Jews, or I don't think in Chicago anymore. There used to be some buildings on East Lakeshore Drive that sort of didn't have any Jewish residents. I don't think that's true anymore. So we are kind of living in a different context in which people are operating. Yeah, Andy.
Well, are we on mute?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I just have to, I sort of had the opposite experience that Sue is describing, and I'm not that much younger, but I did not like being told that I should, date Jewish boys, or I should, I didn't like member of our tribe. I wanted to, why could you not like Germany? You're making such generalizations about people. I was so rebellious to that. And I already said, I went to Bethel, and, I was rebellious there too, in my own way. And I really didn't come back until I went to college, and I began sort of like a demonstration proof, that I saw other religions in a way that did not appeal to me, and that I could start relying on the teachings. That's really what it was about for me. But I joined National Council of Jewish Women. I made lasting friends there. I needed these people, just as a young mother in the suburbs, but it didn't work for me to have that imperative. And then even as an adult on the board of another synagogue, there was a big discussion about if a cemetery could allow non-Jews to be buried with their spouses in a Jewish section. And it became something about what kind of an example are we setting for our children? Like, your children are really thinking about where they're going to be buried, that it's like a real, it was ridiculous, and it was not pleasant. And, I just have always pushed back against that kind of stuff. And yet I feel very strongly about being Jewish, and much more so now that as I've gone on.
Well, this is very interesting. I think there is a tension in Judaism it's both a tension and it's a mutually reinforcing notion of ethnicity and religion. They're two different things in some ways. Ethnicity is more our culture, our history, our stories, whereas religion is the way we pray and identify. But in Judaism, the two are mixed and mingled together, because you can be Jewish and identify with Jewish causes and not do anything and go and have and never step foot in a synagogue. There are plenty of Jews throughout history. I don't think Einstein went to synagogues very much. I know Louis Brandeis didn't. A lot of the people we identify as sort of the, very celebrated Jews in American history never went to synagogue. And yet they proudly identified as Jews. Now that would be impossible in Christianity or Catholicism. That's, you are Catholic or you are Christian. You can be Christian because you're born that way and you're baptized, but you wouldn't be identified as a great Christian if you never step foot in a church. It's an oxymoron, but you could be within Judaism. Now, that's both a blessing because it keeps people tied, but it's also a curse because religion creates a sense of obligation and commitment that you have to do this. Whereas ethnicity doesn't really. Ethnicity is something that you're born into, it's who you are, and you kind of do it automatically. And when you lose that as you move over generations, ethnicity has much less pull because it's always changing, right? And so and by the way, it's very interesting. One of the things I always thought was somewhat of a weakness of Legacy Congregation Solel was that we didn't really have any brotherhood or sisterhood, women's group or men's group. And because of that, there weren't that, I mean, people knew each other, obviously, but, part of that's just being in Highland Park. But there weren't social organizations that connected people. And I thought that was a weakness. Now we have a lot of that already. But the reason was, when the congregation was founded, it was, the goal was to just be about religion. We are about religion and religious values and social action. Those were the sort of two. And in some ways, they were kind of revolting against the sisterhood, brotherhood type organizations that they saw as sort of snobby and this kind of thing. But ultimately, those organizations are good. They keep people tied together. So sometimes we can take for granted some of the social ties that people have, and then you can lose them if you don't really encourage them. Whereas with religious practice, it creates a sense of obligation, like you have to do this. So
I just want to say one thing, because it exemplifies what you said. So when I was a freshman in college, there was someone in my corridor who some Sunday morning called her parents. She got off the phone and she said, "Oh, I told them I went to mass. That's all they care about." And she didn't go. So she was lying. I was appalled. I thought all I would have to do is know that I was a good person and I would be a good Jew. And I that was so clear. It was like, oh my God, how could she have done that? And they were happy, or it didn't matter.
check.
So it's just what you said, right?
Yeah.
But it was a
Very
turning point for me.
Very interesting. Yeah. But, I mean, not to defend her for lying completely, but at least in some ways, she knew the importance of going to mass, at least to her family. Maybe later on in life, she did go to mass, although who knows? But yes, you're right. Sometimes there's a lot of hypocrisy in religion, and that can be a problem. This, by the way, is true in England. Most English Jews are nominally Orthodox, but they're probably the same in their behavior as Reform Jews are, but they, belong to Orthodox synagogues. So sometimes there's a lot of hypocrisy when you have religious obligation. Okay, Jill, then Alice.
I had the opposite experience. I went to the University of Michigan, the opposite experience with Hillel. I went there. I was interested in going. And because I had such a liberal upbringing from Sinai,
Right.
Hillel meant nothing. I never went again.
Right.
Although when I think about it, all of my college friends were Jewish. It wasn't because I chose them because they were Jewish. It just, they happened to be Jewish. And then
Interesting.
it's interesting. I'm sure this is not just with my family, but my brother, who was raised with the same family, the same congregation, the same rabbis, he's one of those that doesn't want anything to do with congregations. He says he admits he's Jewish, but he doesn't want any organized religion. He doesn't believe in it. So we're completely different on that score. From the same family, same upbringing.
And what does he say? Why is that? What
He
is
just-
his reason?
He just doesn't want to follow that path.
Yeah.
And he's got a scientific background. I don't know really if that has anything to do with it, but it's just his moral and ethical beliefs are the same, but the organized part, he doesn't care for.
Very interesting. Yeah. Some of it's just personality and temperament too. Yeah. Alice.
Yeah, well, this goes along with what everybody's just been saying, but I'm just thinking of my own family. Okay, so I have two children. One, my son is married to a actually somebody who was brought up very religiously, went to Jewish day school. Anyways, they're sending their children to Jewish day school. They belong to
DC.
What?
They're in DC, right?
DC, yeah. They belong to a synagogue.
Yeah.
They're going the whole thing. Okay. My daughter, who's here, she married, and this goes to what you were saying, Rabbi, about the ethnicity and the religious part of it. Okay, our daughter married a young man who, I mean, I love dearly. I mean, I'm not saying anything, who is half Jewish. His father is Jewish, his mother is Catholic. He was raised not with either. He was raised that they celebrated all the holidays. They celebrated Passover and Hanukkah and Easter and Christmas. They had no organized religion on either side. Okay, so now my daughter, who's all Jewish, marries him. Our daughter, she loves that, because she loves the whole thing. She grew up with a friend who also grew up half Jewish. And she just loved the idea that the family did everything. That is very appealing to her. And so even though our daughter brings Judaism into the home, I don't think they'll ever belong to a synagogue. They won't belong to a church for sure. They will never, I don't think they'll ever belong to a synagogue. And I said to my husband I said to Bob the other day, it really makes me sad, because yes, you get a lot from your home, but there's something, I still think there is something that you get from the institution that you can't get from your home.
Do you think they'll have a bar mitzvah for their kids?
Oh, I doubt it. Highly.
Really? Even though we did the namings, I remember that, you know?
Oh, well, yeah, I know.
It's interesting.
I can't see them ever joining a synagogue, but who knows? It's not me. And I really don't bring up that kind of stuff, because I don't want to sow any, they're the most wonderful people in the world. I love them.
know your daughter's wonderful. Yes.
And my son-in-law. So,
yeah.
So it's like, that's kind of like their worldview. They're very accepting of all people. They like diversity. I don't know. They just, they like the multicultural. They have friends from every ethnicity you can imagine. And they just like that. So
it's fascinating.
So I have two kids that are complete opposites.
Complete opposite. That's so interesting. That is so interesting. And so, yeah, I mean, part of that is certainly just personality. Part of it could be kind of the work that we're so influenced by our environment. I mean, your son has worked for Jewish organizations. Maybe that could have influenced him, whereas your daughter's a teacher.
Yes, but our son, the minute he landed on a college campus, he got involved in religion. Not before. I mean, he was bar mitzvahed and he went to confirmation, but I don't know what it was. He landed on that college campus and he just took off with being involved with religion.
So interesting.
I don't know why.
Yeah.
Who knows why?
In some ways, I kind of think, as someone who studied American history, in some ways, the way Judaism is evolving in America is uniquely American. And that's always been true. For example, in Zionism, American Zionism was never about Aliyah. In every other country, Zionism was about getting people to make Aliyah, move to Israel. In America, that was never what it was about. It was about supporting Israel as a haven for Jews, but we were happy in America. And now I think American Judaism is evolving in really interesting ways, where you can kind of have other holidays and other commitments as part of that. And there's a big interfaith component. And so it's almost in a way less ethnic. And this is, by the way, what Mordecai Kaplan, this is why he rejected the idea of the chosen people, because he believed that was too ethnocentric. And he believed that American Judaism was evolving differently. And maybe in some ways, this is a fruition of Kaplan's vision. The danger, though, is doing nothing, you can do things differently, but how do you pass that on? That's the tricky thing.
Exactly.
And the reason I ask about bar and bat mitzvah is there are a lot, my wife works with a lot of them, to be honest with you, who don't join a synagogue for whatever reason. Some of them, it's rarely they can't afford it. It's usually, they just don't, it's not of interest. But they want their children to have some sort of experience, and they do have bar bat mitzvah. So there are a lot of unaffiliated people who have bar bat mitzvah. So
Yeah.
it is a possibility.
Yes.
Yeah. And the truth, see, the thing about American Judaism, and it's interesting, is people recover it at different parts of life. You know, I've had people who, I remember doing one wedding of a guy, the bride was Christian. The groom essentially grew up Christian, but one of his parents was Jewish, and they got into Judaism and they embraced Jewish life because that was his heritage and he felt a connection to it, and they wanted a rabbi at their wedding, and they've gotten involved in Jewish life. So in some ways, people kind of enter at different stages, and that's something uniquely American. You know, we can kind of reinvent ourselves wherever we are and change. Yeah. Marcia.
Yeah, hi. I have sort of the same experience where, I've come more into like my mom being traditional Jewish and everything. And I was brought up in the Catskills where the only option really was Orthodox. So like the women sat in balconies and that. And my father, though, was anti-organized religion, and he didn't want any part of it, but he enjoyed the traditions. My mother did Shabbat and all that, and actually she taught in a Hebrew day school. But anyway, so she insisted that we join the synagogue and that my brother go to Hebrew school because she insisted he had become bar mitzvah, which my father didn't. He did it because he didn't want my mother to divorce him. I mean, she wanted him to become bar mitzvah. And no one had ever done this before. Now it's very common for a child to do like the whole everything in the service. But this was an Orthodox synagogue that did everything in Hebrew for hours and hours and hours. For about 4 or 5 hours, he conducted the whole entire service. And then, but he always, took after my father a lot, and he always was, with the hippie movements and the social justice and anti-Vietnam, and he totally went away from religion. And now he doesn't celebrate anything. But once a truck stopped and asked him if he was Jewish, and he said yes, and the guy handed him a menorah, so he lit the candles. But he said he didn't even know it was Hanukkah. But he said he believes in man being a good person. He'll be at women's reproductive rights protests and and voting rights and all of everything. He's more into social justice, but he doesn't have anything to do with anything organized. And then I also have 3 kids, and the oldest one belongs to a synagogue in Beacon, New York. Has a home in Beacon, and which is on the Hudson.
That's where that great art museum is, right?
Right. Right.
My dad took me there
That's
once.
right. That's right. For the it's not that far from West Point and from Hyde Park. It's on the Hudson, and she also actually has a condo in New York City where she's a forensic psychiatrist. So I guess she can afford that. But she totally. I mean, she sent me a picture of a vegan challah that she made for Shabbat. I mean, she's into religion. And my son grew up, I mean, they all grew up at Solel, and he totally embraced his religion. They live in Bethesda, Maryland, and they belong to a congregation. And his wife chose Judaism, and Judaism chose her, and she went through all the rituals and the mikvah, everything, and she does Shabbat, and they send their child to an Orthodox Hebrew day school because they love the practices. They love that how it's activity driven. They don't sit the kids in front of like a video machine or TV, and they're doing. And every Friday, the kid comes home with my granddaughter Talia comes home with a challah that she baked, and his twin sister married a guy from Montana, and I don't think his family had ever met a Jew before her, but she says she keeps the traditions, but they celebrate Christmas with his family, but she celebrates, she does her thing for Hanukkah and Passover and the holidays, and she knows when they are, and she observes them, but they don't belong to any organized
That is so
congregation.
interesting. You've got the
Yeah.
whole Penelope.
Right.
Yeah.
The whole,
the mosaic. Wow.
well, I
mean,
know.
It's tremendous.
Go figure. And actually, my husband was from a conservative. I mean, he, which tended toward orthodoxy. So I was very comfortable going to, Passover with his family, and he was comfortable coming, to my family. And so I know it's just,
Wow.
it's just how kids, they kind of go their own way.
It's amazing, and in some ways, again, it's sort of going back to America, people have so many different opportunities, and people will gravitate. In some ways, the more options you have, the more sort of future possibilities you have. Before, so this is a really important concept. Prior to about 1970, if you were going to marry somebody not Jewish, now there are exceptions, but if you're going to marry somebody not Jewish, you are essentially leaving the Jewish community, unless that person converted, but mostly it was sort of an exit ticket. Not that you would convert out of Judaism, but you just would essentially assimilate, not be involved at all. Starting in around 1970, somewhere, there's no set date. It could have been a little earlier, but at that point, as Jews are more accepted, you have more interfaith couples joining, and you have more people maintaining some sort of connection to Judaism, even if they are not following the traditional path. The traditional path was you marry somebody Jewish. It's sort of how Sue described it. This is how you grew up. This is what you did. This is what you passed on to your kids, so forth. And for many people, that's still the path. That's still, which is fine. But there's so many more options now. And some of those options are open more because anti-Semitism, at least on an establishment level, is down. Opportunities are open. The Jewish community is more affluent. You have more opportunities to do certain things, and travel and go places. So, and also there's more opportunities to go to Israel. So there's more orthodoxy. So there's more people there are plenty of people I know in our congregation. And I think one person in particular, her brother is totally Orthodox, and there are plenty of people who have one person in the family who's secular. The other is, a Baal Teshuvah, someone who becomes ultra Orthodox. So, in some ways the opportunities are so much bigger now and so much vaster. Right. Yeah. Jill and then Edie.
In terms of the diversity of everything that's available in society today, my older daughter, both my daughters went to Sinai. My older daughter was not confirmed, and she did not have a bat mitzvah. Confirmation turned out to be a conflict with somebody she was dating who had a senior prom on that day.
This is Carrie? Yeah.
Yes, she had a senior prom to go to on that day, and that won out. And for the bat mitzvah, all she wanted was the party. She didn't want to study, so I nixed that. My younger daughter was confirmed and bat mitzvah, and is very not necessarily interested. I think she'll eventually join a synagogue, but she celebrates everything. And my older daughter, as you know, you're about to do a baby naming for her, and she's very into all of the traditions of Judaism and does Shabbat. And they're just, I would never have believed that those paths would be that way because of the way they were raised younger.
Interesting. Some of it could have to do with the spouse too, because Josh grew up did Josh grow up more observant?
Very conservative.
Right. So some of it has to do with who you end up with, I know plenty of people in the synagogue, who are more involved because, the fact they just did a bat mitzvah, even the dad's parents told me, or the dad said, we would have never joined a synagogue had it not been for my wife who grew up, so sometimes people, it kind of ends up who you're with, and so there's so many other factors. It's a great point.
Sherry's boyfriend that you'll meet has a Jewish father and a Christian mother, and he celebrates everything, and so that's why I think they celebrate. And Sherry was raised celebrating Easter and Christmas, not, I mean, in my family, everybody wanted to assimilate. So we didn't do Passover. And so it's just, that's the way. And she's got friends in terms of diversity because she was in the Peace Corps. She's got friends from all over the world, very
So
diverse.
interesting.
Yes.
So interesting. Yeah. Edie.
Yeah, I've kind of, can you hear me? I don't know if I have my, yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
I've kind of run the gamut. I mean, I'm going to backtrack because I'm so surprised about a conversation I just had with one of my sons the other day. But I've been all over the place. I grew up going to an Orthodox day school, never Orthodox enough, so never really fit in. Belonged to a conservative congregation, which was Reconstructionist at the time that we joined, that then became conservative. It was a compromise joining Solel 40 some years ago, no, more than 50 years ago, about 50 years ago, I think. There was a compromise for Julian and myself. My in-laws were very involved in Solel at the time. We were here for about 25 years, left and went to a more traditional Eitz Chaim for a number of years until Julian said, you know, I'd really like to go back to a Reformed congregation. I wasn't ready to come back here. So we went to Lakeside and here we are. One of my
You did the
sons,
full circle.
yeah, right. It never occurred to me not to belong to a congregation. It was just part of my being, even though there were painful things. And I will just share my best religious experience. And I've shared this many times, but it made such an impression upon me. We lived on the near north side, and I was playing outside. It was a beautiful April day. I was a lonely child. I had no friends because there were no kids in the neighborhood, and I was playing hopscotch. And this man came up to me. It was in April, and it was a Sunday morning, and it was the second day of Pesach. And he said, "Did you go to synagogue? Did you go to church today?" And I said, "Yes, I went to Ratei Tzedek." And he said, he took his hands, put them on my head, and he said, "Bless you, my child." He was the late Cardinal Stritch. He lived across the street. It happened to be Easter Sunday and the second day of Pesach. I have to tell you that feeling, I still feel those hands on my head.
Wow.
And no rabbi through the years has ever shown that kind of warmth to me, going all through day school, and my mother was hospitalized a lot, so I was really on my own a lot. I never had that outreach, but being part of Jewish life was very important to me. One of my sons is very involved in his congregation, and ever since their baby was born, even beforehand, and the second was becoming a bar mitzvah in a few months, and the other one, whose daughter became a bat mitzvah recently in another congregation. And I said, "Well, what about so-and-so?" She said, "Well, I don't know. They're spending so much time talking about social action, which is what they do at home all the time, that she's learning nothing about her tradition at all, or her religion at all." Finally, after hearing that this is like the third congregation that they've done this with, and just by nature of their own personalities is another story, I said, "You know, you might want to think about just doing a tutor and an independent service," which I never would have said earlier. But I just realized that everybody comes to it at a different place and a different time and a different way. And so I don't have an answer. And there are times where I've really, questioned, why did I go this route and why did I go that route? But I have to say that I can go into a synagogue any place and be very comfortable. And I'll just share this very quick anecdote. One of my sons just came back from it was a business trip to Morocco. And he wanted to see the synagogue. So they took him to the synagogue, and it was a Tuesday morning. They didn't tell him that it was an Orthodox synagogue. The rabbi came up to him, or the congregational president, he thinks it was one of the same. There were a total of about 12 people, and he said, "Did you bring your tefillin?" And he said, "No." And he handed him it. Well, David has never laid tefillin, so he kind of wrapped him around it. He said he still has the welts on his arms. And after about, once they took the Torah out, he was ready. He had other places he had to be because it was a business trip to be that day. And he put the dineros or whatever it was in the pushki for all them, whatever. And then he's walking out, and all of a sudden the rabbi comes up to him, runs up to him, sir, 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 to hand him his business card. Okay. So then when he gets back to his hotel, the person in front of the hotel said, oh, I heard you went to Minyan yesterday. And he said, well, yeah. He said, well, let me take you to the other temple, synagogue, the one that doesn't have services anymore, but that's historic. So meanwhile, he told him the story about how long the Jewish community was intact. And when a lot of people made Aliyah in the 50s from this town in part of Marrakesh, there was an Islamic person who took care of the houses after the people left. And every Sunday, he made the rounds of the Jewish cemetery to visit the graves. And Dave said he was just in tears when he heard that, because that connection was so strong, and just that feeling of connection. But I have to tell you that with my very good Jewish background, Julian and I both say that we learned more about Judaism at Common Ground from the late Ron Miller, may he rest in peace. We learned more about taking a class on the whatever it is, and the post, the return and so forth.
Yeah, he was a great teacher.
So to be open to just a variety of wherever you can get any, I mean, I feel comfortable in all synagogues, but I probably feel comfortable in a lot of churches too.
Sure.
I appreciate the experience of spirituality wherever it is. So I'm kind of
Thank you. That was beautiful.
A hybrid.
That was beautiful. Okay, Andy and Jill, and then we'll conclude.
Well, this is just kind of funny, and everybody might know this, but I mean, I think we get something that we're born with, that we have an affinity, and, you know, we have different experiences with our kids. Our daughters were always involved in Jewish education, and I mean, I can't say they loved it, but it's just a very big part of them. But, you know, our grandson, who is,
he's an adorable guy.
He wanted to know if the camp that he might go to is Jewish. He is writing about the Torah in he's probably the only Jewish kid in his, there might be one other kid, I don't know. But everything is about Judaism, and they're not, you know, they're normal. They're not kosher, or they do Shabbat and everything else, but he just really loves it. And he did go to, he went to Temple Emmanuel camp last year, and it was run by a Chabad. And he really was into that. He had this picture with the Modiani every morning. It had to be there. But, you know, he's mellowing out a little. But, you know, this is just who he is.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, some of it's just personality, what you're attracted to, what's interesting, and that's genes, whatever, you know, it's so interesting. Okay, last comment, and then we'll conclude. Yeah, Jill.
In terms of what organized religion can provide, when Kennedy was assassinated, I spent practically that whole weekend at Sinai. That was where I felt comfortable.
You felt comfortable. Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, I mean, I think that's something to always remember. And this kind of goes almost full circle back to what Alice was saying at the beginning about joining groups, in that you sometimes don't see all the benefits, but there are tremendous people who actually belong to a church or synagogue live on average 7 years longer than those who don't. Isn't that interesting? Part of it is, in some ways, it gets you out into community. You build friendships and social relationships. People who belong are more charitable. They give more, generosity. You know, there are so many ancillary benefits that you don't always think about, but that push, you know, most of us are pretty naturally selfish in some ways, you know, we have to be. But when we are in settings that call upon the better angels of our nature, we become better people in some ways. And that's what organizations can do to us. So thank you all. This turned into a wonderful discussion, and I'll see you next time.